Alright. Ooh. Is that candy? It's candy? Miss Carney, candy? Ooh. Alright. Always on the lookout for candy. Anywho, good to see you all at the end of January today in class. And just a reminder that tomorrow is the first quiz number 1. I already had a couple students ask me in the last class, so I should say it now. Please don't ask me what time the quiz is, how long you have it. It's all in the syllabus in great detail. So if you do ask me, which is fine, you can ask me. I'm just going to say, what does the syllabus say? All right, so look in the syllabus if you want to know how long you have and what are the requirements, how many questions will be on the quiz, stuff like that. All right, so be aware of that. All righty. Getting back to the Catholic Church and other religions. Yes, it's probably going to take me one more class to finish it. I apologize. I always do too much. I need to pare down. But, oh well. Hopefully you're enjoying it. Or if you're not enjoying it, you're making it through. Shouldn't laugh when I say that. You laugh when people suffer? No. We looked at that, St. Dominic, and we looked at that, and we looked at our kitty cat friends, 2 of whom are not living anymore, but that one is. Oh yes, Her Majesty. Second Book of Kings. Okay, yeah. Yeah, I was talking about Naaman, this Syrian gentleman. Aramean, he's called. The ancient Syria, called Aram. Okay, there's on the map the city of Damascus, ancient city of Damascus. And he comes down here to the northern kingdom where he hears there's a Jewish prophet who might be able to heal him of his skin illness, his skin disease. And, he thinks that, because he's a pagan, and magic is a major part of a lot of pagan religion. You do say certain spells, certain words the appropriate way. You combine certain things, if you watch Hocus Pocus, yes, anyone see Hocus Pocus? Toe of a dead man, eye of a newt. You put all the right things into the potion, or even like Harry Potter when they made Sleeping Death, remember, in his potions classes. You put all the right things in the potion, then it has to do what you want it to do, right? So Naaman is a pagan. He's assuming that, Elisha is going to work some magic or something, and he doesn't, and that surprises him. That puzzles him. It's like the Jewish God is different. Elisha consults God and says, go into that river, a certain river, and bathe. Plunge yourself in the water. So that confuses him. Believe it or not, the ancient Jews did accept the existence of other gods. Okay, they were not polytheists. They didn't worship many gods. They only had one God. But they did recognize that there were other lesser beings than the one God, than their God, that other people worshipped. They were always lesser beings than the true God of Israel, who was always seen, as I said, the true God, the only one who really should be considered a God. He was more powerful than all the other gods. And in the ancient Near East, people thought that, a god or a group of gods ruled a particular region. So, for example, Naaman probably worshipped this god, which was the god of his region up here in Aram, god Baal-Hadad, also described in the Bible as name is Rimmon, okay, but more commonly known as Baal-Hadad. Okay, and this is an image of Baal-Hadad with a the thunderbolt. Find that imagery a lot in ancient religions. Find it, in Hinduism and Greek religion. Zeus has the power of the thunderbolt. Who has the power of the thunderbolt in Hinduism? It's in our textbook. It's in the textbook. I'll have to look it up in a chapter on Hinduism. Also, I think he's holding an axe. I think that's an axe. Okay? But yeah, so this is a picture of the god that, Naaman probably would have been worshiping, but it was not the god of Elisha. It was not the god of his region. You know? So Naaman's questioning, why do I have to go to another god? Well, because your God won't heal you. Your God can't heal you. But apparently the God of the Jews can. So it's interesting. This is not, Israel's God is not bound in a way to a region. He's not, he can heal someone even from another god's territory. In this case, Rimmon or Baal Hadad, which is interesting. So Israel's God is different here. He's more the God of a people. It's not, well, this is the God of the region of Israel or the kingdom of Israel. This is the God of the Israelites, the sons and daughters of a man named Israel, which we'll learn about later when we talk about Judaism. But it's the name of it's the God of a group of people, a family group, really, the sons and daughters of Israel. And so the God of Israel is not bound to any region. He can heal anyone from any place, even Naaman from Syria or Aram. But if the God of Israel is not bound to any one place, then one can infer that all places belong to him then, even the regions that supposedly belong to other gods. So in a way, the God of Israel, Yahweh, can usurp the power of Rimmon. It's Elijah's God, or Elisha's God who saves, yes? Elishahu, yes? God saves, that's his name. It's the Israelite God who saves. The Syrian God is unable to heal Naaman. That's why he's there. Have any more? Okay. So Naaman's, also the way the Israelite God acts is different. He's expecting some kind of magical thing to happen, but the God of Israel doesn't need magic. He's thinking like Elisha is going to do something and make his God provide a healing. The God of Israel don't play that. He does what he wants to do. You don't force him to do anything. So he's not like the pagan gods. So he's surprised Elisha doesn't use magic to heal him. Instead he says, in the name of God, go and wash. And Naaman's like, that's weird. Go and wash. Why? So Rimmon could not save, but Israel's God could. Well, that's interesting, but I'll skip over that. And Naaman is cured, if you read the story. He comes out of the river, and his skin disease is gone. So it's a Festivus miracle, Mr. Vital. Yeah. But anyway, so he's cured, and it's such an astounding thing or an amazing thing for Naaman that he decides that he's now only going to worship the God of Israel. Which again, I think I told you this before, it was very unusual. You didn't put away, you might integrate other gods into your own personal group of gods, your family's gods, or your tribe's gods. But you didn't put away your ancestral gods because they're your ancestral gods. You have to honor them. Okay, the health and the wellness and the prosperity of your group was based on how you were honoring the gods of your fathers, your forefathers. You didn't just put them away and reject them. But Naaman's rejecting Rimmon, Baal Hadad. He said, I will not worship. I now know that there is no God in the world except in Israel. So he asks Elisha, he says, let me take a little bit of dirt from here, from Israel, so that I can bring back with me to Damascus, where I'm from, so that I can build an altar to this God of Israel. So I'll only offer sacrifices now to this God. I won't offer it to this apparently false God who can do nothing for me, Baal Hadad or Rimmon, because he's not truly a God. Okay? Hold on a second. Just want to find the story. Elisha and Jehu. Ahab, where are you? Shunammite woman. Hear me in ambush. Someone looking for it. There we go. Elisha cures Naaman's leprosy. Yes, okay. This is in chapter 5, 2 Kings chapter 5, verse 17. Let me have some earth for your servant. He's not really his servant, but it's a nice way of talking. You know, I'm placing myself beneath you because you've helped me. So he calls himself his servant, although Naaman is like a court official in the royal court of Syria, and Elisha is just this lowly prophet. You know, but let me take some earth, because your servant will no longer make burnt offerings or sacrifices to any other god except Yahweh, the Lord. However, verse 18, and this has some interesting interreligious import for us. But may the Lord forgive your servant this, when my Lord, meaning the king or his ruler, enters the temple of Rimmon, Baal-Hadad, to bow down there as he leans upon my arm. Which he probably doesn't mean literally. It probably means I'm attending to him. You know, so maybe he does literally lean, like he leads him around, he holds him, you know, as he's walking and stuff. Maybe. But as he leans on my arm, I too must bow down in the temple of Rimmon. When I bow down in the temple of Rimmon, may the Lord please forgive your servant this. Elisha said to him, go in peace and burn in hell. I don't know why people burning in hell makes me laugh, but no, it doesn't make me laugh. No, he says, go in peace. He doesn't upbraid him and say, no, you only have to worship, you know, you can't do that. He understands the context and the situation that Naaman is in. Naaman does not believe in Rimmon anymore. He will not worship Rimmon anymore. He says as much. However, because of his position in the royal court, when his ruler has to worship this false god and bow down in worship and adoration, he also has to. Otherwise, he'll get into trouble, probably be killed. And, you know, Elisha's like, okay, basically, if I'm interpreting Elisha, the prophet Elisha, correctly, you know, he's not saying it's okay to worship false gods if you now believe this is the true God, but I understand your context. And, you know, that might be what you have to do. But he knows where his heart is. He knows that he's a believer in the God of the Jews now. So that tells us, well, I already gave you that. Monotheism. I don't put monotheism on here. Well, you know, monotheism has to develop amongst the Jews, but that's one of the messages that is in this story that the author is probably trying to get through. Because in the ancient world, and even in Judaism, the Jews did, as I said, recognize that there were divine beings, and their divine being, God, Yahweh, is his name, was the greatest of those divine beings. It takes time for the idea of monotheism to develop in Judaism, and the ideas kind of compete for a long time. There's that faction of Jews who are saying, no, there is only one God. Our God is the only God. All of the pagan gods are nothing. They don't even exist. They're false, so don't worship them. And then there are a lot of other Jews who are like, no, our God Yahweh is the greatest of the gods. He's the most powerful of the gods. But yeah, there are other spirits and gods and stuff like that. They kind of have that. So it takes time for things to develop into pure, what you might call pure or ethical, as they say, monotheism, which is the belief that only one, monos, one in Greek. Monos means one or only. Theos, we know, means God. So only one God. And you kind of see this in the story. I mean, Elisha doesn't challenge the existence of Rimmon. He doesn't say to Naaman, like, hey, your God doesn't exist anyways. Yeah. He accepts the fact that Rimmon can't heal you. Of course he can't heal you. He's not as powerful as the God of Israel. All right? But the person who wrote this story down about Elisha also maybe has his own agenda of trying to show that you're right, because as Naaman says, I now know there is no other God than the God of Israel. Kind of like pushing people to monotheism, a monotheistic agenda, But it's going to take time for it kind of to hook people in and take effect in Israel. And again, I'll talk about this some more when we talk about the history of Judaism. Acts of the Apostles. I'm going to skip over this. I'll stay here just for a second because I want to mention Paul. But the reading from Acts of the Apostles, I'm only going to look at one thing in the life of this man, Paul, who was an early Christian leader, the leader of the Christian community, this man Paul. And I'll talk more about him when we get to Christianity, because he's very influential in the development of Christianity. In fact, some people might say that Paul is actually the founder, in a way, of Christianity. That the Christianity as we understand it, maybe more so than Jesus in some way. But this book, Acts of the Apostles, was written, we believe, by a man named Luke. It's attributed to someone named Luke. And we don't know much about him. He seems to have been a companion of this man Paul, this leader, Christian leader Paul. Seems to have traveled around with him at some times. And so he wrote actually two books. He wrote A Life of Jesus, which is the Gospel of Luke, A Life of Jesus. And then he wrote a second part, which is kind of a little history, very brief history of the early church, of the early Christian community, and it spread throughout the world, okay, throughout the Roman Empire. And that's part 2, called Acts of the Apostles. So really the Gospel of Luke, if you're ever looking in your New Testament, if you're a Christian, the Gospel of Luke, even though they're separated apart in separate places in your New Testament, they really are together. They should be together, part 1 and part 2, you know. Anyways, so, and scholars believe that the Acts of the Apostles was written around 70 or 80 AD. 70 or 80 AD. After the Gospel of Luke, obviously. But around 70 AD. And it talks about this, it's focused really on two people, two main leaders in the early Christian movement. I'm talking about Paul, but Peter. We don't want to forget about Peter. The first half of Acts focuses on this man named Peter, who was the first of Jesus' apostles. Not the first called, but he was the first in preeminence and honor. And then this man Paul, who became a disciple later, who died around 65 AD. Good about Barnabas. He's not in this story that we're going to talk about. I don't think he is. I forget if he is. I don't think he is. So I ask you to read from Acts chapter 17, which tells about Paul arriving in the city of Athens in ancient Greece. So if we go over to modern day Greece, well, there it is. Athena, Athens. Okay, ancient Greece, there's the city of Athens. All right. So he arrives in this city and begins preaching the message about Jesus. And he stirs up some interest amongst the locals. Text here. You can follow along on if you have the internet, because I have a link to the Bible on under modules. Ms. Rayner. Okay. Did anyone else? Has anyone else had problems getting onto the YouTube playlist by going through the modules on Canvas? Like you click on the link, you go down where it says class lectures or video recordings, and you click on the link there that should send you to the YouTube playlist. Mr. Belfield?
It just says class lecture videos, then there's nothing in there.
Nothing under it. Okay. Does it take you to YouTube at all? No. All right. So maybe the link is wrong. Maybe I put in the wrong link or needs to be. I'll have to check it out and see why it's not working. I apologize for that. I mean, I did check it when I did it. Seemed to be working at the beginning of the course, but something could have been, I could have made a mistake or whatever. So I'll check it out later today when I get home. Thank you, Ms. Rayner, for pointing it out to me. Okay, so Paul arrives in Athens, and according to the story, he's exasperated at the sight of a city full of idols. full of idols. That's how Luke opens the story, which is kind of interesting. He does not like, well, Paul is Jewish. That's his background. And he's a rabbi as well, so he's a Jewish teacher, a Jewish religious leader. So, of course, he believes in Judaism and monotheism. There's only one God. And he certainly agrees with, like, the prophets, Jeremiah, the Book of Wisdom, or the Jewish writings that condemn idolatry. So the city of Athens is full of statues of gods and goddesses and stuff like that. And so Paul does not like this. Okay? And in fact, in the Greek, it's even more explicit. I mean, in the English here, in my translation, it says, Paul grew exasperated at the sight of a city full of idols. That's kind of vanilla. That's not really what the Greek says. The Greek says that Paul's spirit burned within him. Okay? He was, the Greek word here means literally provoked, irritated. Wasn't exasperated. He was angry. He was provoked that wherever he looked around, he saw statues of these gods. And it doesn't say it's the city full of idol. The Greek word actually should be idol-ridden. It should be translated as it's idol-ridden, infested, kind of like with cockroaches. It's infested with idols that were provoking him. Okay, so he hated them. But notice he doesn't hate the people. He doesn't hate the people living in Athens, but he hates all these idols. They provoke and irritate him. Okay? They still reveal to him their search, the Greeks' search for God, which we'll talk about later. Now, as Paul is going through, he goes to the synagogue because he is a Jew, and he talks to Jews there. It even says he talked to some of the local philosophers in Athens. And, he stirs up some interest because this sounds like he's preaching a new religion. Okay, the local Greeks are like, they hear Paul preaching about this Jesus and a resurrection, okay, which in Greek is anastasis, which means is the Greek word for resurrection, but it's also it's a woman's name. It could be the name for a woman. So they actually misinterpret. They think Paul appears to be preaching about a new God named Jesus and his consort, his female goddess, his wife in a way, Anastasis. Okay, and they want to know about this. They maybe learn about this new teaching that you speak of. Okay, because if there are different gods, they also want to worship them. They want to honor them. Okay, because they should not be worshipped. Because if you miss a god, like if you forget, you don't know about a certain god to worship, that god can hurt you or harm you, get angry that you're ignoring him or her. So they want to be very diligent in making sure that all the gods and spirits were properly worshipped. And so they asked Paul to come to a place called the Areopagus, which in English means the hill of Ares, god of war. Ares, the god of war. Right? Areopagus. Which we know whether that is, because archaeologists have found it. So there it is. It's an outcropping of rock. You can see people visiting it on top of it. So this man, Paul, at some point apparently had this conversation with a group of intellectuals who wanted to hear more about his teachings, judge what they were, judge maybe if they were even appropriate if it were appropriate for him to be allowed to preach them in the city. And so there's a record of that conversation in Luke's Acts of the Apostles. Luke's audience is educated. These are educated people. So he's not that uneducated people are dumb. I'm just saying that these are people who have an educated background, and so Paul takes a more philosophical tack when you compare Paul's speeches in Acts of the Apostles. This is much more philosophically based, whereas in other speeches Paul appeals to like the elements of the earth, the seasons, the weather, the planets and stuff like that. Here he's not doing any of that. He's taking a more we could say theoretical approach to talking to these people. And he opens with a kind of sarcasm, which they also don't really catch terrifically well in this translation. But anyways, he stands up at the Areopagus and says, "You men, Athenians, I see that in every respect you are very religious. For as I walked around looking carefully at your shrines, I even discovered an altar inscribed to an unknown god. What therefore you unknowingly worship, I proclaim to you." Okay? He opens with a bit of sarcasm, which was not unusual in ancient speeches. Remember protreptic, the genre of protreptic. When you want to convince your audience and you want to get their attention, maybe you open with a little joke or something at their expense, or a little poke at their expense to kind of get them like, oh, now aroused. They're like now listening. Oh, what's he going to say to us? I see that you are very religious. Well, that's not exactly how the Greek should be translated. The Greek is more like, you are so much more God-fearing than anybody else. It's like overstating it. It's not just, oh yeah, you're very religious, you're very spiritual. No, he's being sarcastic here. You are so overly, beyond anyone else on the planet, fearing the spirits, the gods. Another way of interpreting the word, another meaning it had in Greek, was superstitious, which is more negative connotation. So it's ambiguous. It's almost like a backhanded compliment. You're superstitious. You're overly religious. You overdo it. You have a god here, a god there, a god here. You even have an altar to a god just in case. So any god you might not know. So you have an altar to an unknown god whose name you don't know. You admit that you don't know this god exists, but you feel like, well, we better have an altar anyways, just in case we miss one. So you're overly religious. I mean, they're religious to the point of admitting that they don't really know all of the gods. But that's Paul's hook. Paul's like, I'm going to tell you about the God that you admit that you don't know, this unknown God. And so he starts into his talk. Okay? And a lot of the things that Paul says, that his hearers would not have necessarily disagreed with philosophically. The God who made the world and all that is in it does not live in temples made by human hands, doesn't need anything. Yeah, we find that in ancient Greek philosophy. The common people might have thought that about the gods, that they lived in the temples. The temples were like their houses, and you had to feed them through sacrifices. But the more philosophically minded in the ancient Greek and Roman world kind of knew that that wasn't really true. The gods didn't need to be fed, and they weren't really present in the temple, in the statue. But it was okay for the common people to believe that, but the philosophers knew better. So Paul is not really saying anything that they would have had a problem with, and that our source is from the gods. And Paul even seems to quote from some pagan writings here. Did I write that down? Hold on a second here. Or did I put that on the PowerPoint? I think I did, yes. Very religious, yes. Okay. God made the whole human race to dwell on the entire surface of the earth so that people might seek him, even perhaps to grope for him and find him, though indeed he's not far from any of us. Again, the translation has groping, which, okay, that's accurate enough, but that's not exactly what the Greek means. It means like groping around in the dark, as if you're blind. You can't see. So you're like, what's that? So again, it has more of a negative connotation. It's not like, people are just searching for God. Your search, he acknowledges the search, but you're blind. You're incapable of finding what you're searching for. You're groping. For in him we live and move and have our being. This is where the pagan quotations come in. Very interesting. Because I have a question mark. Scholars think it comes from a man named Epimenides of Knossos in his work called the Cretica. But it's not clear, because in him we live and move and have our being also seems to be a very common phrase used in other Greek works. So it might have been just like some stock phrase, just some slogan that people use in talking about God. We live and move and have our being in God. True? Okay, that's fine. Certainly not from the Bible, I know that. So he's quoting from their writings, apparently. And he's explicit about the next thing, which we do know comes from where it comes from. As even some of your poets have said, for we too are God's offspring. We're his children. And that comes from Aratus Soli in a poem, Phenomenon. And he's talking about Zeus. He's talking about Zeus. He probably means, Aratus probably means offspring literally. Like, we are literally the children, the progeny of the god Zeus, ultimately. It's not, Paul's a Jew. He doesn't mean that. He means that we've been created by God. Okay? So his interpretation of Aratus is different, but he's trying to find common ground here in their ideas, even though their ideas might be completely different from the Jewish idea and the Christian idea. So if we are the creation of God, God is our origin, we shouldn't think that the divinity is an image fashioned from gold, silver, stone by human art and human imagination. Okay? Yeah, he's like us. God is like us, and we are like God. Now, he's going to have to explain that statement a little bit more. Are you trying to say God is a human, or humans are God? I don't think so. Well, I think the point of his argument is we're certainly, the gods are certainly not stone and wood, because that, and covered in gold and silver, because we're not, and we make them, we make these things, okay, we fashion them. So just logically, God shouldn't be, if it's God, God is higher than a human, I would imagine, in the realm of being. So he's not made out of stuff like stone and made by humans. He made humans. We are his offspring. He's not our offspring. I'm forgetting something. I want to say something else. Well, maybe not. Oh, that's what I wanted to say, yes. And again, for the philosophically minded Greek, there would not have been a lot of disagreement with that. They would have agreed, I think they would have agreed that the gods were not contained in the stone statues or wooden carvings that the other people, the common people, liked so much. They had maybe a higher knowledge than they thought than the common people. So they're kind of on the same page with Paul there. There wouldn't be a lot of disagreement. Nevertheless, they still wouldn't have said, like, tear down the temples. They still would have thought, or stop the sacrifices. Because, you still had to do them. They're still part of your tradition and your ancestral traditions. You still had to perform them. Even if you had a higher knowledge of why you were doing them. God has overlooked the times of ignorance. Where are we here? But he demands that all people repent. They change their mind. Repent is a fancy word for changing your mind or changing your heart. Because God has established a day on which he will judge the world with justice through a man he has appointed. Okay, so this is where we start. Now we're starting to diverge here. Okay, because I don't think you find this idea of a final judgment of the world. You do find it in Judaism and, of course, in Christianity, which comes from Judaism. I don't remember encountering it in the pagan religions of Greece and Rome, that there would be this final judgment. There might be a dissolution of the world, a destruction, like the Scandinavian peoples believed in a final destruction of the universe, and the gods would be killed. Some of the gods would be killed, and everything would be burned up in fire. But it wasn't really a judgment on humanity where God's going to say, okay, were you good? Were you bad? Separate out the good from the bad and reward the good and punish the bad. That was a very Jewish idea. Okay, so here we're starting to diverge here. Paul's getting into his specific message. And people are going to be judged by a judge appointed by God. He doesn't say the name of Jesus, but, he's a Christian. So you imagine that's what he's talking about, because he was preaching about Jesus, we know. That's why the Areopagus wanted to hold a council and hear more about this Jesus he was talking about. Jesus is this man who's been appointed by God to judge the nations, to judge all peoples. And God has confirmed this, that Jesus has this power and authority by raising Jesus from the dead. Raising Jesus from the dead. Ooh, that's interesting. So now the idea of anastasis or resurrection. So they realize he's not talking about a separate female god, a goddess. He's actually talking about this idea of the physical body coming back to life and coming from the grave. Which again was a Jewish idea, okay? Not all Jews believed in it at the time of Jesus, but it did have a number of supporters. Jesus certainly believed in it, but it developed late in Judaism. And there were a number of people who did believe at the end of time there will be a final resurrection where people's bodies and souls will be raised up again. The Greeks did not. This was nonsense to them. This was outlandish. And you can see from the reaction that Luke records, because as soon as Paul, they're with him up to that point. They can agree up to that point. Then when he starts talking about physically coming back from the dead, which is so stupid, so nonsensical to them, the conversation is over. Okay? When they heard about resurrection of the dead, some began to mock him, scoff. But others said, "We'd like to hear this from you, but at another time." It's like when an actor calls up his agent, and the agent's like, yeah, I'll call you back sometime. Don't call me, I'll call you. Like, and you wait, right? Yeah, okay, Paul, yeah, interesting. We'll talk to you again sometime when we have a moment, when we're not busy. And so Paul left them. But Luke notes that some did join Paul and become believers, and he named some of them, Dionysius and a lady named Damaris, okay, a woman. Some members of at least one member of the Areopagus, apparently. But most of them were like, no. Because again, remember what I told you, I think I told you, about, I talked about the underworld, yes, and Hades, and I talked about it, yes. Is it in this class? Their conception of the afterlife? No? Oh, it's all good. And still get paid. Anyways, their conception of the afterlife is simply no one came back from it. You died, you were hopefully buried, and your soul, I guess you could say, went into the underworld, traveled into the underworld. Where, in the underworld was kind of like this dark place. It wasn't a very happy place. It wasn't and everyone went there. Good, bad, rich, poor, it didn't matter. It didn't matter what you did in your life. There was no reward or punishment. It was simply the lot of the human person. You went down into the ground, and then you traveled from the ground down into the underworld, and that's where you stayed forever. They did punish some people in the underworld, but usually it's because from the myths that we have, they were like really bad people, like they committed incest, which is like this, for the ancient world, was one of the worst crimes you could ever imagine, sleeping with one of your parents or something, incest. But also trying to deceive, like there were people who tried to fake out the god of the underworld and come back, then they get, according to the myths, they get found out. So they would get punished, of course, because they tried to get out of the underworld. No one ever escapes from it. That's the one thing. No one dead escapes from it. The only way you would not go to the underworld was if your body were unburied. But then your lot is to be like a wandering, angry ghost until someone buries your bones. And then you can go to the underworld and be miserable. So at least you're not an angry ghost. You're terrorizing human beings. You're just a miserable ghost in the underworld under Hades, the god of the underworld. So, they didn't have that conception. That was, or at least that was their conception. But the main thing was nobody came back. And it made no sense for somebody to want to come back, especially with Paul's idea that you're going to come back with your own body, that Jesus, at least in the case of Christianity, this man Jesus is raised with his body okay, that he had. That was also kind of disgusting because they thought of it like being a zombie. You didn't want to come back in this body. This body was corruptible. It grows old, it gets weak, it gets sick, and that doesn't change. Okay, that doesn't change even in the underworld. It's not like your body gets any better. So to come back from the underworld, you come back like a half human or some kind of warped, distorted human. You want to eat people's brains. In the zombie movies. That's how they thought of it. So for Paul, this is completely ridiculous to them. It's nonsense. So they don't want to hear any more of it. That's where the conversation breaks down. Okay. So what can we take from Paul's discussion about understanding how the church understands other religions, I guess we could say? Well, Jesus is God's response to man's search for meaning. For meaning. Okay, human beings reach out. They grope around in the dark, but in a manner of speaking, in a metaphorical way of speaking, Jesus is the hand that God reaches out in this darkness to grab the hand of men and women and lead them to the truth. Right? As Paul says, there's a time of ignorance. God has mercy on those who do not know or could not know. All right? And of course, the Greeks didn't know about Jesus until Paul was preaching about him. There are even people today who don't know, believe it or not, in areas of the world that never heard about Jesus or maybe heard something that there's Jesus, okay? Because there are places like in Asia where, most people are not Christian, so they're not like sitting around talking, handing on Bible stories or anything. Jesus is as foreign to them as if I started, talking to you about Vishnu. I'd be like, Vishnu who? What? Same with them. Jesus what? They don't know his story. They don't know who he was. They know maybe some people worship him as a god, maybe. They know there's a religion around him. So they're ignorant in the sense of not knowing. Not stupid. That's not what it means here. But they're not knowing. But now they have knowledge. Paul has brought them the knowledge. And the times of ignorance are over. Okay? So there's a difference with Jesus. Things are not the same. It also explains why Christianity is impelled kind of to be a missionary religion. The message is so important that people need to know about Jesus because he brings the truth. And Christianity is not the only missionary religion. Buddhism as well. When the Buddha was enlightened, we'll learn more about the Buddha at the end of the course. But when he received his message about how to become woke, before woke was a thing, because that's what the Buddha means, the awakened one, he was tempted to just keep the message to himself, but it was so important he needed to spread it out to others, to help others. Christianity has the same idea. People need to know about this man Jesus because they believe that he is the ultimate judge of the world. And to find true life, people must accept him or believe in him. Okay, now let's skip over to church documents. Catholic does, some of which, or at least some of which you've hopefully read by now, some excerpts, not whole documents, but some excerpts. One whole document, though, but it's a short one, Nostra Aetate. The documents I ask you to read, and I want to focus on these basically because they're a good summary. I mean, I'm not going to go through the whole 2,000-year history and development of how the church arrived at these views. I'm just going to I think they'll just give you this summary from this last council of the Catholic Church in the 1960s. The Second Vatican Council, 1962 to 1965 AD. Does anyone know why it's AD and what AD means? Did you check out your textbook? Anybody? Ms. Rojas! Do you know what AD means? How do you know it's not BC? What do you think, Mr. Belfield?
cheated. Anno Domini.
You cheated?
Well, I looked. I didn't cheat.
Where'd you look?
Um,
Okay. Not in the textbook, but I want you to get your money's worth. Anyways, Anno Domini, which means what? This Anno Domini. What do we think? We think, yes, she's looking like it. I told you not to do that, Miss Warren. You're not, you're making me look bad.
You want to recommend what you do?
Did you hear what she said? Ms. Bowler,
No.
I would have recommended her to do it if I didn't want her to do it. You should be coming back. Anno Domini. Yes, the year. Well, no, I won't tell you. Read the textbook. What does it say? In the year of the Lord Jesus. Yes. So this council was held 1,962 years since the birth, we believe, of Jesus of Nazareth. We'll find out when we talk about Christianity. Our calendar, the monk who made the calendar was off by a few years, but close enough. Okay. So the year of the Lord, all right? The 1960s. It's called the Second Vatican Council because there was a first one back in the late 1800s. Okay? It's called the Vatican Council because it was held at the Vatican in Rome, Vatican City, which is its own country, smallest country on the planet area. On the Vatican Hill, Rome is a bunch of hills, various hills. One of them is called the Vatican. And an old church was built there where they see St. Peter the Apostle, one of the followers of Jesus, was buried. So Vatican Hill, it's a big church. And they held a council. A council is simply a meeting, a student council, right? A meeting of all the bishops, the religious leaders of the Catholic Church came together in St. Peter's Basilica, this church dedicated to St. Peter at the Vatican, basically because it was large enough to hold all the people. And held this council for 4 years, basically, 62 to 65. The council was convoked by that man, St. John the 23rd, who was Pope at the time. But as you can see from his dates, he died during the council. But the council was continued by the new Pope, Pope St. Paul VI. Here they are, wearing their papal crown, because of course, yes, the Pope is a religious figure, but as I told you, he's also the head of state of a nation, Vatican City. So he has crowns, a crown, it's a tiara, it's 3 crowns. You can see it better with this, 3 crowns, one on top of the other. Popes don't wear those anymore. Even though the Pope still technically is the head of state of Vatican City, but they don't wear crowns anymore. It's a little too medieval, I think. They think it's a little too medieval and showy, I guess. I like it. I like the bling. I think religion should be fun, but that's just me. Anyways. So the Second Vatican Ecumenical Council, held in Rome. There's a picture of the bishops meeting in the church. Uh-oh. I lost her. She'll be back. Did she say maybe? Anyway, so there they all crammed in, okay, for the meetings. It's an ecumenical council because ecumenical means universal. Just the Greek word means universal. Basically, it means all the bishops of the church, or as many that could come, were at the council. It wasn't a local council of just a local area of bishops or religious leaders. It was supposed to include all the leadership of the Catholic Church, so it's universal. And as I said, a council. A council is just a coming together, a meeting. But in a religious sense, when councils are held, at least for the Christian idea, it's the meeting of bishops who are called to decide matters of teaching or discipline, so what we believe, what we should do, stuff like that. And, a number of councils have been held in the church. Usually councils are called to address issues or problems, usually problems that have to be decided. They're not common. Whatchamacallit, I guess the problem for Vatican II, as it's called, shorthand, Second Vatican Council, was modernity. Modernity, the church's relationship to the modern world. Okay, remember this was a question. Oh no, actually not in this class. I talked about Vatican I in my Christian faith class, but anyways, this had been a kind of a brewing issue for a while, ever since the Enlightenment in the 1600s. What is the church's relationship? Should it be? What should it be to these developing, the development of modernity? Modern science, modern all sorts of things, new forms of governance, like democracy and nation states and stuff like that. The idea of religious liberty and the separation of having some sort of distinction or separation between religion and the secular state and stuff like that, or I should say the state. And for the most part, the church's reaction for, a couple hundred years or a few hundred years was very negative. It took a very negative view of these developments. But that apparently needed to change, and Pope John the 23rd decided that the church needed to take a fresh look and maybe reevaluate her relationship with the modern world. Look at it, not, the negativity hadn't worked maybe, it hadn't really converted anybody. So maybe if we took a more positive, or made a more positive presentation of Christian belief and teachings to the world, that would be a better approach. And so that's what, that was kind of like the idea, one of the ideas. Okay, there were other issues. There were, so how can the church kind of renew herself, maybe make changes that didn't, change things in the church that weren't working anymore in the structure and stuff like that. Not the teachings. They weren't going to change teachings, but they wanted to re-express the teachings in more with modern ideas or in a modern fashion for people to understand and hopefully accept. That was in the 1960s. Of course, this was before Woodstock, Ms. Winko. And the sexual revolution and all sorts of things. And now maybe 30% of Catholics attend Mass every Sunday? How did Vatican II work out for us? We lost half of our nuns, 100,000 priests left the priesthood. Yes. Anyways. Yeah, the jury's still out on whether the council, because not all councils are successes in the history of the church. There have been like 20 some of them. I think this was the 22nd, if I remember. I write it down here in my notes. No, I didn't. I think it's Vatican II is the 22nd Universal Council of the Church. Not all of them have been successes, and I think the jury is still out amongst historians of the council about whether it is a success, has been a success, or it's going to be maybe in another century or so. But the initial statistics do not bode well. Have not bode well, I should say. So, the church, in regards to our topic of religions, we saw in the Bible there was a very kind of negative viewpoint. Religion was mainly viewed as just idol worship and was to be condemned and avoided at all costs by the faithful Jew. Even in Acts of the Apostles with Paul, he still had a very negative reaction towards the idols he saw in Athens. But in his relationship with the people of the Areopagus, the educated people, he was willing to kind of talk to them on their own terms, quoting from some, writings that they might have agreed with or knew. But he was also trying to lead them to his message, to change their mind and to accept Jesus. Okay? Even though they weren't Jews. It wasn't already for Paul in his mind, the message was not just for his fellow Jews. He was seeing that, wait, there's a world out there beyond Judaism, and if Jesus is, for example, God in Paul's mind, he's the God of everybody, not just Jews. And throughout the church's history, as I said, there was kind of that kind of negative view was probably the most enunciated, when looking out at other religions. Vatican II tries to have a more positive view. So retains the traditional ideas and beliefs. It's not going to change its teachings, but it wants to state them in a more positive way and also show development. So we have this from the dogmatic constitution on the church, or in short, Lumen Gentium. Those are the first two Latin words of the document. It was written in Latin. And so instead of having to constantly say over and over again, dogmatic constitution on the church, for shorthand, you can just say Lumen Gentium, the first two words. And it's a dogmatic constitution. It's a very high authority. It's it's dealing with dogma, which is official teaching. And it's a constitution, so kind of like our U.S. Constitution, which tells us and constitutes our government. How the government is formed, what are the parts of the government. It's dealing with the constitutional beliefs of the church, essential ideas that make up the church and what Catholic belief is. So the dogmatic constitution, so it's a high level of authority. Its topic is the church, the community of believers in Jesus. And in number 16 it says this, what I would like to read. It's from your readings, hopefully. So I would like to read this from number 16. Yeah, about Taylor Swift tickets. Don't all maul me. They'll rush it once. I got you, sir, but you've done something. You've done enough. You can do more about the rest of it, but I'm just saying, yeah, let's get. So you decided to come back?
Yeah.
Good.
With my stuff, no.
Good. Anybody? Yes, class participation, 15% of the grade. I mark it. I try to keep a record. Ding. All right, Miss Bessie, do you want to read it? Can you see it from back there? Can you see it well enough? Okay. Covenants, good. And merciful, good. Excellent. Thank you very much. So from Lumen Gentium number 16, this is a rather famous statement. Okay, there are people they're talking about Christians and the church, the body of Christians, the believers. But there are those who are related, those who don't accept Jesus as the Christ, or he's not their Lord and Master, religious, whatever. But they are still related in various ways to the people of God, to the church. The first, those from whom Christ was born according to the flesh. Who are they? Who are those people? Where did Jesus come from? Where did Jesus come from? Which group of people? My ancestors are Irish. What were his ancestors? Yes, Mr. Whitehoff. Jews! The Jewish community. The people of the covenant with God, the contract with God. We'll learn more about this when and the promises, okay, from whom the Christ or the Messiah was born, okay, who are still most dear to God, okay. Judaism is accepted as a true religion by Christianity because Christianity and modern Judaism, we'll find out, they come from that source. Jesus was a Jew. He wasn't a Christian. So there's a gradation here. First, the closest related group are the Jews, which makes sense because Christianity comes out of Judaism. But then the next closest that the church identifies, the Catholic Church identifies, are those who are submissive to God, Islam, Muslims. Because they also honor, for example, the Jews, or at least honor Jewish ancestors like this man Abraham, who's the father of the Jews, the father of the Jewish nation. God gets the ball rolling. God bless you. They adore the God of Israel. They believe that God revealed himself to the Jews as well. Muslims believe that. They also believe in Jesus. They believe Jesus was the Messiah of the Jews. And that he rose from the dead, too. They don't believe he was crucified, though. But that's another cup of coffee we'll talk about later. Nevertheless, so they have some beliefs in common. There's a closeness. But then there are the other religions in which people search in shadows and images for the unknown God. Oh, where have I heard that before, Miss Hoy? Yes, the unknown God. Okay, so they're appropriating the language of Paul in Acts of the Apostles. Okay, we could, extrapolate. They don't say explicitly which groups these are, but I think, Hinduism, Buddhism, okay, the natural, what they call, whatchamacallit, what's the word, or the phrase? I have to look in the textbook. I guess you could say tribal religions or native religions, okay? Animism, sometimes the anthropologists will call it, a belief in spirits and stuff like that. Shamanism, where you have people who interact with the spirits and stuff like that. But yeah, so these would be, I think they'd all be dropped into the same bucket of this rather brief statement. And yeah, they're searching for the unknown God. Maybe he's not so unknown. I don't know. I'm not in these people's hearts or souls, so I don't know how much they're in relationship with God or not. Okay? I've certainly known people who are Hindu or Buddhist who seem to be very good people. So, yeah, I'm not going to deny just, what's the word I'm looking for? Deny just outright that they can't be in a relationship or don't have a relationship with God. They don't know God in some way. Some ways they might know God better than I do. Maybe better Christians than Christians in a manner of speaking. But because it's God who gives all men their life and their breath, again, they're kind of hearkening back to that Acts chapter 17 in Paul's speech. And God wills that all people be saved. So God is reaching out to us. He wants us to be saved. He wants us to know him and to find him. Okay, he's not hidden in that sense. He's not hiding from us. From the same paragraph, or the same section, I should say, number 16, the question might be, well, but what about people who don't have a religion? People who don't believe in God, or don't know if you can know there's a God, or whatever. How do they fit in? Well, there's this. We'd like to read from this section of Lumen Gentium, number 16. Go ahead, Mr. Princio. Thank you. A priori. Sorry, go ahead.
Strive by their deeds to do his will, as it is known to them that he pays in conscience. Nor does divine providence deny the help necessary for salvation to those who, without blame on their part, have not yet arrived at an explicit knowledge of God, but who strive to live a good life thanks to his grace. Whatever goodness or truth is found among them is looked upon by the church as a preparation for the gospel.
I know, I'm just messing. Okay, very good. So yeah, here it talks about people who don't necessarily believe in God at all. I don't think they say atheist, do they? No. But you're getting the point, okay? And those can be saved as well, okay? Well, actually, let's get to that in a second, because the atheism will come down here. What about Paul says the times of ignorance are over, okay? But there's still a lot of, Paul is speaking in, probably the 50s or the 60s AD, okay, the start of Christianity. Paul didn't know about North and South America. I'm assuming he did not know about Australia, or all the millions and millions of people who were living in those areas who had no possible way of knowing about Jesus Christ or anything related to Christianity. Okay, that's not their fault. And the principle is, and I agree with this principle, that God is not going to judge me or judge someone, I should say, on something that the person possibly couldn't know about. So those who, through no fault of their own, don't know about Jesus, don't know about his church, but they are still sincerely seeking God, genuinely looking for God, and are moved by his love. Grace is just a fancy theological term for God's love, his help that he gives. Try by their actions to do the will of God as they know it through their conscience, through their moral knowledge. It's another way you could translate conscience. All right? Which might be very different from the moral knowledge that I have as a believing Christian. And some, I think I mentioned this before. Maybe I did. Sometimes. My thoughts overlap from class to class. But in a lot of cultures, slavery was a common reality. No one questioned it. It was a part of the society. It was built into the society. It's part of warfare. It seemed perfectly natural to people that if you defeated another group, they became your property. We would say it's enslavement, but for them, you're booty. You're now property. So you can take the people. Are those people morally, in those cultures, are they morally responsible for that now, according to my standard as a Christian in 2025? Will God judge them for following their conscience, what they were taught by their culture, their society, even by their religion at the time? About how they could act. I think they'll be judged by the standards of their conscience, of what they knew. If they believed it was wrong and they still did it, that's another thing. If you come to a decision of moral knowledge that, no matter what someone's telling me, my culture, whatever, I think it's culture saying it's right, I still think it's wrong, and I go against my conscience, then that's a different thing. That's, I think, blameworthy. But if you're being told, part of the religious practice is the sacrifice of humans every now and then to the gods, so people offer themselves sometimes willingly, sometimes not. I might not like that, I might have a problem with that. And, of course, Christian missionaries, when they encountered stuff like that, and they showed up in, the New World and stuff, and the Aztecs were doing it, told them, well, don't do it. Once they became Christians, of course, hopefully willingly and not be by force. But, can I condemn them for following what was in their conscience that they thought was morally right? Okay, so you have to take that into context into account. Okay? They're trying to follow what their morality is guiding them to do. Even though I might, as a Christian in 2025, say, nah, that morality is not good. All right? But then again, that's why the church is trying to bring the gospel, the message of Christianity, to other people, to give them that knowledge that they have through Jesus about how to act and how to be fully human. But God doesn't deny the help necessary for those, even without blame, of course, don't believe in God, have an explicit knowledge of God, but who also strive to live a good life, thanks to God's help. Okay, God is still in a relationship with them. They are not subhuman, which sometimes that was a question sometimes for missionaries. When they encountered Native Americans, are they even human? How should we relate to these people? The church, they had to make a determination about that. And the church was like, no, they are human. They're created in the image and likeness of God, like everybody else. They are in relationship with God, even if they don't have an explicit. This is where I think atheism can come in. Even if they don't have an explicit knowledge of God or belief in God. And there can be goodness and truth found. Now, this is revolutionary. I mean, this might seem obvious. There are good people who are not Christian or believe in Jesus, and there are people, obviously, who can seek after the truth and do seek after the truth who aren't Christian or whatever. They're not evil people or, morally inferior or something like that. But this is revolutionary because people could have thought that and sometimes did think that in previous centuries. Christians could think that, just because they're not Christian and they belong to another religion, that morally these people are inferior or they're not living a good life. But they could be living a good life. And they were, I would say. I think the encounter, this also was part of modernity, was and kind of a byproduct of colonialism, which I know everyone's supposed to be boo colonialism, but as Europeans moved out into places like India and other parts of Asia, Africa, encountered people living these other religions, they started realizing that, wait a second, some of these religions teach very good ethics and ways of life, and people are very ethical and moral in them. They're not bad people just because they're a person's a Hindu and not a Christian. And that's, what Paul kind of says. He doesn't condemn the Greek Athenians as bad people. He says they're not knowing, they're ignorant, they don't know the truth, but they're searching for it, and they're trying to live by it as they're finding it. And that's rewarded. God will reward that. So even goodness and truth can be found amongst non-Christians. However, people can still be deceived. Our minds can deceive us. We can deceive ourselves in our own reasoning. We can think something that's really false is true. We can also have despair. Okay? For example, if you see no purpose, if you don't believe in a God and so life is purposeless and meaningless, people can despair. What's the point of even being alive? And if you're a Christian like me, and yes, the church still does believe in evil spirits, there's deception involved. People might be deceived by evil spirits, tempted to not believe, or not be open to believe, I should say. Okay. All right, I'll end here and come back to it next week on Tuesday. God bless you all. Have a good weekend. I'll see you in February.